All right, well, let's just jump in the interest of time. So yeah, before I think the best way to start, Jeff, is I'll just get you to introduce yourself. Uh, my first introduction to you was via the most recent Tales from the Crypt
Okay.
podcast, and I know you're fully aware of this, but obviously, when I was listening to the podcast, part of me was thinking like, a lot of what you were saying was somewhat unconventional as far as how Bitcoiners think about governance, economics, that kind of stuff. And so that's what kind of tickled my interest. And then we had a little exchange on Twitter about, I think, the opioid crisis or something like that, opioids generally, and regulations and stuff. So I thought it would just be fun to hop on the pod and have a chat. But like I said, before we do that, maybe you can just introduce yourself to people that like hadn't listened to that show or aren't familiar with you yet.
Sure. I'm Jeff. I do a few things related to Bitcoin, I guess. Probably, I guess the most interesting thing probably to most of your listeners is I maintain the BTC Pay Python library.
Hmm.
That's just sort of a side gig for me. I do in my free time. My main business is Keykeeper IRA, which is basically a product where you can hold Bitcoin in your IRA using tax-free retirement funds, but all while you also are holding your own private keys. So it's a non-custodial solution.
Hmm. And just so everyone gets the full picture, uh, bodybuilder, CPA, attorney. Am I missing anything?
No, I don't think so. And my phone just went off. Let me silence it. I apologize. I forgot to
No
do that.
worries.
Yeah, I am a competitive bodybuilder, and yes, I'm licensed as an attorney and a CPA, which sort of ties into my main, IRA business. That's legal in nature. Absolutely.
Before we get into the Bitcoin and economics stuff, how'd you get into bodybuilding? I asked because when I was in high school, I was, enthralled by like the Arnold's Book of Bodybuilding, and I was, a gym rat for a number of years. But I'm just wondering how you got into it.
I started lifting when I was I was in high school when I started lifting as well. I got into it originally because I was like fat as a kid through like most of elementary school. So
Me
it was
too.
kind of like an outlet. Yeah, I think that's a really common reason to get into it. So I got into it then, never like anything remotely competitive. In high school, I went about it in a stupid way, like I think most people do when they're that young. And then as I got older, I started to get a little more serious about it. But again, never competed or anything. Believe it or not, I didn't start competing until I think I was 30. I might have been 35 by the time I started competing.
Wow.
Yeah, so 34 or 35 when I first started competing. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I had the time. It's one of the few sports that works well for me because it's sort of a discipline-based sport. It doesn't require a huge amount of coordination. Like I played baseball in high school through varsity level, but I was never any good. I was like a bench utility player, type of thing.
Right.
So, bodybuilding's more about just the strength, the sort of natural genetics, which mine are okay, not great, and just the discipline.
And so how often do you compete throughout the course of a year?
No. So usually, so I compete in drug tested orgs. So in natural bodybuilding, you're competing. I mean, it's really pushing it to compete not necessarily one show a year, but during one period of the year, you might try to nail a couple shows in a row, but then you've got to come out of it. 'Cause without the drugs, you're gonna get pretty messed up if you try to stay that lean for a long time.
Right.
So I basically compete like every other year. So I competed in 2019, so I probably won't compete again until 2021 because it takes me 4 months to get ready for a show. I usually have to lose about 20 pounds, and without obviously losing a ton of muscle and looking bad. So that's quite a challenge. So 4 months to get ready for the show. You compete for I don't know 6 or 7 weeks, and then to sort of get your strength back and recover from being that lean takes a couple months. It could take a month or two. So if you were competing every year, you'd never be making any progress because you'd be spending
Right.
your time cutting and recovering and competing, because you can't really make progress in the gym when you're prepping for a show because you're eating so little. So that's why every other year is a better way to go. I get a year to try to actually make some gains and make some progress.
And how have you done with it?
I'm still only, I guess, like 3 to 4 years into competing. I have never won the overall at a show. There was a show that I did this past year where I won the 35 and older, which is an unusual category to have at a show, because all the shows have masters, which is 40 and older for the most part. This one also had just like it wasn't even a separate category, just a sort of a special award, I think it was, for like 35 and older. So I won that. That's the best placing I've ever done in a show. The best placing I've ever done in the open in a show is second. I've finished second once in 2017.
Right. And when you're cutting, in the cutting phase, I guess leading up to a show, what's your process for doing that? Like, how do you cut?
You just ratchet down calories slowly over time. So you start with a decent deficit. Like if you know where your maintenance is, you try to cut maybe 500 or 600 calories below that,
right?
Until you stop losing weight. And then when you stop losing weight, you drop a little more, a little more, and eventually those calories get really low. And then you can start adding in cardio too, more and more as you get closer to the show. That helps create a deficit as well. I mean, your body adjusts to cardio though, so it only works for so long before you have to add more of it to keep losing weight. So
how do you cut the last bit of water, like leading up to a show? Is there a certain technique, like salt balance or anything like that?
Yeah, I don't do anything too nuts with that. That's the real hardcore water cutting you see more often in the non-tested organizations. For a couple of reasons. Number one, they can take prescription diuretics. We can't, right? So that's one major difference. And then two, the steroids have their own water retention issues and things like that. It's sort of a different ball game for them.
Right.
On our side, on the natural side, usually all you're trying to do is, as you get really close to the show, not drink a ton of water, like not parch yourself, but not go nuts drinking gallons of water, and then not do anything weird with your salt, meaning you don't want any major fluctuations in salt one way or the other in that week before the show. You want to just keep a pretty consistent salt, whatever your normal salt intake is, you sort of want to stay there so that you don't end up with any weird fluid balance issues, which can go in different directions. And then some guys do take like a teaspoonful of salt in a glass of water, like right before they get on stage. I don't typically do that. It does increase vascularity a little bit if you do that.
Right.
But most of my, deal is just trying to keep salt level, not do anything stupid. For that reason, like that week before a show, usually you don't want to like eat out or anything like
Sure.
that.
And what's your first meal once you get off stage? The giant pizza or something, or do you go nuts?
I don't really like pizza that much, so no,
Oh, no.
Pizza's not really my thing.
Right.
I'm trying to think. This last year, I actually didn't do anything all that particularly crazy. I just went and the final show that I did this past year was actually in Reno, Nevada. So I just went to like a taqueria and got some tacos, and that was about it. Nothing
Nice.
too outrageous.
And I'm assuming, being a natural bodybuilder, like, do you try to find natural ways, whether they be dietary or, movement based ways of like naturally bringing up testosterone, or do you just kind of go hell for leather working out and what it is?
It's controversial. Most of the natural testosterone boosters don't do a heck of a lot. And there's
Right.
some evidence that boosting your testosterone, if you're already within a good physiological range, doesn't help very much. It only really makes a difference if you're sub-physiological. Then it's obviously boosting your testosterone is going to make a big difference. Or if you're at the physiological level and you take like steroids where they're going to push you up to super physiological level, obviously that makes a huge difference. So I don't do anything too crazy. I do take boron, which is helps with free testosterone a little bit. And obviously the real important stuff is eating a healthy diet, getting your sleep, all that sort of stuff.
Lots of squats.
The only real testosterone, quote unquote, testosterone boosting supplement that I take would probably be boron.
Right. Cool, man. Well, yeah, that was just a little bit of a tangent, but it, like, back in the day, it was something I was super interested and into. So I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit and see what you were doing with it all.
No problem.
So let's get to the meat of discussion. And so why don't, I mean, if you're comfortable starting it this way, and if you're not, just let me know how you'd like to get into it. But
Yeah, no problem.
why don't you lay out kind of, you had that article on Medium. I think it was a post-capitalist world, something to that effect.
That was
right?
the first one. Yeah, I've done a little short series of them. Yeah.
Right. So, for people that didn't listen to the other podcast, why don't you just lay out your economic political philosophy in as concisely as you can.
Yeah, sure. So I guess it's first to just kind of mention that when people talk about capitalism, they can mean different things, right? Some people I grew up in the Cold War, I'm guessing you did too. Back then it kind of just meant like any country that wasn't affiliated with the USSR, right? So by that standard, I guess I'm a capitalist. But today, a lot of times I feel like it particularly in the Bitcoin community, gets defined a bit more narrowly in terms of, a real emphasis on free markets. So when I talk about capitalism during this discussion, I'm going to be using sort of the latter definition, meaning sort of a libertarian take on capitalism, where markets are self-correcting. The invisible hand is going to guide society to the best possible place, and government should just get out of the way. So that's when I talk about not being a capitalist or post-capitalism, I sort of use that definition. And part of the reason I use that as well is one thing I'm going to get into in a second, is the distributists did not consider themselves capitalists, and were in fairly critical of capitalism. So in terms of, to give a 10,000 foot view here, I don't reject market mechanisms altogether. So, an orthodox Marxist would reject the market as a method of resource allocation 100%, right? Because they typically believe in more of a central planning type thing. I'm not that far. However, it's my belief that the market is a tool for resource allocation. It's not magic. It's not perfect. It does require, human intervention. Specifically, I think that the market most tends to get out of control when capital becomes centralized, which I believe, due to industrialization, particularly late industrialization, is an inevitability because of economies of scale. And therefore that one of the legal system's major roles, in addition to more generalized methods of, regulating the market such that labor is not excessively subservient to capital, should be ensuring that capital stays decentralized, much more so than would be the case in a, quote unquote, natural free market. And the latter part of that, sort of, if you want to call it my take on political economy, tends to come from distributist writing. For those who are unfamiliar, that haven't read any of my work or heard any of my other interviews, distributism is one secular interpretation of Roman Catholic social teaching on the proper relationship between labor and capital. So in the 1860s, there was a papal encyclical that came out called Rerum Novarum, which even today is the basis of the Catholic Church's social teaching on labor and capital. And by the way, I'm not an integralist. I don't favor religious government or anything like that. I mention this only because that's where all this begins. But the encyclical was it didn't really prescribe any specific solutions. It just kind of more so laid out a broad theory of justice. It was critical of both capitalism and Marxist socialism. It sort of laid out, it was more of a rights and responsibilities type thing. It talked about, employers, what we would call today employers, having basically a duty to treat their employees fairly. It talked about employees having a duty to do their job. It went into a whole bunch of different things. And one of the things that it mentioned was the benefits of private property, and more specifically, the benefits of private property being widely distributed. So in the early 20th century, and Rerum Novarum was the base of a variety of different movements in the early 20th century. So one of which was, which I won't get too far into now, was the Catholic worker movement, which was more of a libertarian socialist movement. There have even been fusions between traditional Marxist socialism and Catholicism. That's a thing that's been around. And then probably the largest of them in terms of being well known, I suppose, is Distributism, which is a economic system both opposed to capitalism and total socialization of the means of production, as you would see in, I guess, in a very extreme socialist system. Not all socialist systems even seek to do that. And the general idea behind Distributism, which is based on originally the writings of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, the idea there was that, pretty much as I said, you want to use your legal system to ensure decentralization of capital while preserving the idea of private property. And we can get into specifics of, what that would more mean as we sort of go along here. And the probably what I think the best book on the topic as to why this would be necessary would be Hilaire Belloc's Servile State, where he makes the point that industrial capitalism essentially has to always end one way or another. Marx thought this as well. Marx and Belloc just differed on where they thought it was going. So Marx thought that communism was essentially inevitable. Belloc thought that a servile state was inevitable. The servile state basically being a situation where capital is very concentrated in a few hands. Those people, due to what's called the capitalist paradox, which we'll get into a little later, essentially need to provide a basic level of benefits for the people that they employ. Otherwise, the whole market would collapse. So that they would essentially be willing to do so, but only do so as a condition of employment, which would essentially create a new type of slavery. Instead of chattel slavery, which is what we're used to thinking of historically during, say, the Roman Empire or even 19th century United States, this would be a wage slavery-based system. And that's why the book is, in fact, called The Servile State. So I rambled a little bit there, so I'll let you start asking some more specific questions.
Yeah, no, that was good. And I'll just, whatever comes to my mind, I'll jump on. But I took two quotes out from the Post-Capitalist article you did.
Sure.
Just two, and so one I'll read, and then we can discuss it, because obviously it's relevant to some of the things you just mentioned. But it says, it's first important to establish that our current era is not imperfectly capitalist, as many claim, but rather indicative of the natural and inevitable arc of capitalism. And I think maybe, and tell me if you're cool with this or not, but for the sake of this discussion, like, obviously we're all, or many of us are interested in Bitcoin because it represents somewhat of a paradigm shift in how things could be organized economically and politically. And that's part of the reason we're excited about it. And so I don't see too much value in nitpicking over definitions of the past. Not too, obviously it's important to do so to some degree, but it kind of looking toward what the relevance of Bitcoin and what it means vis-a-vis political theories in the past, and obviously, of course, what it means independent of any theory of the past, and what it may mean for the future, and how it may manifest. But because to that very quote, I would often say, of course, we don't have perfect free market capitalism anywhere in the world today. We have crony capitalists or social corporatism, or a variation of these things.
Yeah.
And but I would push back on saying that it's not the inevitable arc of capitalism. I'd maybe put an asterisk by that and say it's the inevitable arc of capitalism if the money is corruptible, right? If the government is, if any entity can control the creation, issuance, flows of currency. Absent that, and I think obviously Bitcoin's hardness is something that gets talked about a lot, and people are very enthusiastic about, and for good reason. But I think the unconfiscatability of it changes things pretty dramatically as well. So let's just hang out there for a sec on it's not imperfectly capitalist, but rather the inevitable arc of capitalism. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, the idea behind that, so that's part of the capitalist paradox, and the paradox sort of goes like this. If on some level, you have to believe that there's a market and everybody's competing in terms of efficiency, correct? And the most efficient players typically in a free market are going to be the ones that are going to win. So I'll ask you this question,
Sure.
and we'll see if you guess where I'm going with this. What is by far the easiest way to improve your efficiency in production? It's like a no-brainer. Pay your employees less. It's the easiest thing to do
Okay.
is to cut your
Right.
employees' wages. If you
Sure.
could still get it, as long as you can get them to show up and do what they're supposed to, because capital is like, you can buy a new machine that makes you more efficient, but there might be research and it costs money. And there's like the easiest thing you can always do is just cut your employees' wages. That's by far what any producer would want to do, assuming that they have the ability to do so, right?
Yeah.
So in a competitive market, you've got a situation where in industrialization, you're basically going to have a race to the bottom in terms of wages. Whoever is able to cut, this is not perfectly true, but it's going to be true most of the time. I'll put it to you this way. All things else equal, whoever's going to be able to cut their employees' wages the most is going to be the most successful. That's generally the way things work. In order for what I just said not to be the case, you'd have to have so many employers in a given, let's say for a given job skill, that employees would essentially be the price makers in the market. That has not happened in the industrial market, in the industrial era, other than for short periods of time, weird situations like population shortages that tended to work themselves out, very specific jobs that were highly regulated, things like that. But outside of that, that has not been the case where employees end up being price makers. So in the absence of that market, all the employers, it's in their interest to drive wages as low as possible. Well, the problem with that in a capitalist society is the people whose wages you're driving down are in fact also they're your consumers. So if you driving their wages down, you as an individual producer are benefiting in the short term at least, but you're also creating a recession because you're driving down aggregate demand by cutting your wages. So in the long term, you're going to screw yourself. So one of two things happens. Number one, you drive wages down anyway because you're fighting to survive, and that's the most important thing, right? Or number two, you and your other producers all sort of collude to set a floor underneath what you're going to pay your employees. You essentially create a cartel.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those things are not free markets, right? So that's sort of the capitalist paradox. The free market always collapses in on itself one way or the other, either through a straight up collapse by essentially creating a depression due to a lack of demand, or what we've seen more frequently historically, where producers collude thereby to not drive down wages and not competitively drive down wages in that way. There are multiple ways in which they can do that. If there's a government available, that's the easiest way to do it, is through things like regulation, other things that entrench your existing existing suppliers. Even social programs are a way to do this, because that provides people income that spurs demand for various types of goods. But it really doesn't matter whether a government exists or not. That still has to happen. Whether they would if there was no government, they would have to voluntarily get together and do that. Otherwise, again, wages would be competitively bid down to the point where demand would collapse. So that's generally my point, in that capitalism, to avoid that outcome where you're in constant, essentially depressions and wildly swinging around up and down constantly, you need some sort of a mechanism to save capitalism from itself. So my point is, in that terms of that natural arc of capitalism, what we see today is not like imperfections in capitalism. It's inherent to the system. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And in fact, in all other sort of arenas outside of sort of those basic support, levels for the working class, which are insufficient to ever give them any real agency, of course. They're all just designed, again, to create demand. They're not, they're not being nice. I should come up with a better way to say that. That's not why these things exist, at least in the current era.
Mm-hmm.
I lost my place there for a second. Oh, that it's really the only outside of that and those mechanisms, which are usually what you'll hear libertarian types complain about. We're in like the freest market ever. I mean, in terms of global trade, we don't have price restrictions anymore. Unionization is like nothing in most of the industrial world. Most of these things I think are bad, by the way. But libertarians would think these things are all good. And none of these things have certainly, improved the distribution of resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think many would argue that, and I get your point, and we'll get back to the kind of the linchpin that is the collusion amongst the market, monopolists, and making this all devolve as far as your argument is concerned. But I think maybe many people would say that the regulations and the differing currencies and the taxation and all this kind of stuff creates a ton of market distortions. So people would definitely push back on you saying, it's a very otherwise free market. I mean, I tend to think.
Right, but those distortions. So, okay. So you mentioned taxes, right? Libertarians typically hate taxes. Okay, so imagine a hypothetical where there is no government, right? And so these producers essentially have to collude to create this floor on their own. They can't use the government to do it.
Right.
Well, they have to pay for that. So what are they going to do? They have a couple different things they could do. If they have a lot of power over a territory, they could do something really similar to a tax, where they just tell everybody, hey, if you want to live here and you want to get stuff from us, you got to pay us whatever per day, year, month, anything like that. Starts to look like a lot like a tax, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they don't do that, what's their other option? They have to raise prices in order to provide those benefits in order to stimulate demand. What does that look like? Looks like a hell of a lot like a sales tax. So one of my main conceits here is this whole idea of, quote unquote government, that when these things are imposed by a quote unquote government, they're bad, but when they come about spontaneously through a private entity, they're good. It's a distinction without a difference. And in fact, things are considerably worse with the private entity, because with a government, we might disagree on how much power you have over your government, how much your vote matters, how much all of these things matter. But I know you're not in the private, collusion, servile state situation. You're going to have no power at all. I mean, they're not going to need to pretend to even care about what the governed are thinking, because they're going to be you'll be completely reliant upon them.
Right.
So the government essentially is nothing more than a monopolist on, coercive violence to implement these programs. That's all it is. It's nothing special. It's not like some separate category of
right.
thing.
But back to the original point, the fact that they can create and control money is just a massive, lever that which if a government-like entity was created in the free market, then they probably wouldn't have that degree of leverage, right?
Maybe, I don't know, because
well, let's say in a Bitcoin world, they just wouldn't have the power to create more currency if they wanted it, right?
Depends how few. Maybe. I mean, that's why I care about Bitcoin. It certainly cuts in the direction of decentralization, which is something I care about a lot. But also maybe not. If technological economies of scale were to develop to the point that the number of producers are small enough, they could literally dictate what they're willing to accept and not accept as payment at that point.
True. But I think a lot of this argument hinges on a pretty, in my opinion, what's the word I'm looking for? Unlikely, like perfect collusion, right? Like that first of all, that those actors would, always act in perfect collusion, and one wouldn't get greedy and want to satisfy unmet market demand, and one wouldn't be a rogue, partner in that arrangement or whatever. And two, I just feel like the big, thing that doesn't get mentioned in this discussion is the role that innovation plays in disruption. Like Apple Computer was started in a garage with two dudes, and it took down IBM, which was the behemoth in that industry at the time. So like, I feel like the collusion argument, while there's definitely consolidation in free markets, I get that. I just feel like the ability of the free market to allow for innovation and allow people to freely exchange, capitalize, demand, supply things related to that innovation would cause churn at the top. It wouldn't just
Well,
be, colluders forever. Those guys are the kings of the world forever. It would, it would change and it would morph, and some people from the bottom would come up.
I think, you have a couple things there. Number one, if that were the case, the reason that that's been the case in the 20th century, as you mentioned, Apple, right? I mean, Apple was founded in what, late 70s, right? I don't know the exact year. That era, like the second half of the 20th century, where most of these like innovations and all this great stuff that's always touted as free market took place, we had or had only recently come off of, wage controls, price controls, tariffs, antitrust law, which was enforced a lot more vigorously back then than it is today, high levels of government enforced unionization that we don't have today. So it's always funny to me. We always get these examples that I get from that era of all this growth that's supposedly, attributed to the free market. But when you look at those eras when that growth took place, or that innovation, that creative destruction or new things coming about took place, it was typically in eras that were a lot less free market than today. So that's why I'm not, overly persuaded by that argument. And if you look at, say, other eras where there was less regulation, like the Gilded Age, I mean, what happened? Trusts developed, and those didn't get busted until the government stepped in and sort of saved capitalism from itself, which it had done multiple times in the progressive era, in the post-war era, throughout history. So in the industrial era is mostly sort of a story of booms and busts until we get to the post-war era, when we had a really, really heavily regulated market, and that sort of, smoothed it out. And not everything we did in that post-war era was necessarily good, but it certainly was not nearly as free as what you see in like the neoliberal era today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, just back to that point I made earlier, I think it's really hard to look back at examples in the past and try to project or design something for the future, because I mean, I really do believe we're dealing with a paradigm shift, if none other, with Bitcoin, all of its characteristics that we're familiar with, is that it's a form of property, a form of wealth, it's a store of value that's no longer confiscatable. And I think that fundamentally changes the power dynamic in the world, and just try this on for size. So like, I'm not.
Well, before you get into that, I just want to say something that I've heard this one before. One thing I find really interesting about that, this is not even a critique.
Yeah.
Is that essentially what that argument boils down to is that it basically boils down to the fact that capitalism and industrialism cannot coexist except without Bitcoin. Like, in other words, Bitcoin is the thing under that argument that allows those two things to coexist. Which maybe you're right.
That allows which things to coexist again? Capitalism and what?
Industrialization and capitalism. Basically, what that argument is saying is that, mixing capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism, whatever you want to say, with industrialization has always failed in the past, but now we have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's going to rescue that. That's an interesting argument, in that I can't, obviously it's not a refutable argument. There hasn't been Bitcoin since 2009, so I can't refute it. Mm-hmm. My only point that I always make when I come across that argument is, like, I'm not willing to take that gamble, because if we go too far down this servile state path, we're screwed. Like, there's a certain point of no return there, where we're all just living essentially under a dictatorship of capital, if you want to call it that, or something along those lines. So I'm an all of the above person. If I didn't think Bitcoin was a positive step away from that, I wouldn't spend my time on it. I don't want to give the impression that that's not something that I don't think Bitcoin's a positive in that direction. I definitely think it is. And again, that's why I spend my time on it. I'm just not willing to gamble on the fact that Bitcoin's going to be enough, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get you. And I guess to clarify my stance on it, I do think that the forms of free market, laissez-faire capitalism where they've existed on a scale in the past, have probably been the best form of economic or social organization. I just think Bitcoin optimizes them, let's say. It allows for another, it allows for greater functionality of those systems. And what I was going to say about money is that it's, I and this is not a fully formed thought, but
It's okay.
I tend to think of, if we look at gold or various forms of money in the past, because of their physical nature, when they were accumulated, they had to be concentrated and protected. And basically, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that a lot of the systems, social structures, organizations, institutions that we have in the world are many ways rooted in the characteristics of the money, of the form of exchange that a given society or civilization is using. And so I'm kind of the opinion, and I enjoy these sorts of discussions, and
Sure.
we got a lot more time to run here, but I'm more of the opinion, if you're dissatisfied with the social organization structure, economic system, etc., look to the money and change the money versus trying to change the system and trying to convince people to organize or interact differently. Now, we haven't, Bitcoin was not an option prior to 2009, and gold was, and you could make the case that gold was the best option, but it also led to our current state of affairs. So, that's a fatal flaw in gold. And its other characteristics led to institutions of, that we have. I mean, I really think that as a fundamental mechanism for organizing human economic interaction, the money is where we want to look if we're trying to advance advance our interaction and advance our exchange, advance how we live. And I think if we, let's fast forward 100 years and, hyper Bitcoinization, and it all worked out the way we're all hoping it will. But we're still like, things are still kind of fucked up and they're not really working. And, there's still, unacceptable levels of inequality, if you want to put it that way, if that's your way of thinking about it, rather than saying, we need to revamp our political structure or whatever. I think it would be more beneficial and more effective to go to the money and say, what are the characteristics that the money has? So if we look at Bitcoin, what are all the different characteristics? Let's lay them all out. And how would tweaking, changing, developing, subtracting whatever characteristics, how would that manifest differences and changes in the social and economic system that is layered on top of them? That's kind of how I think about these things, rather than having a philosophy of libertarianism, Austrian, conservative, anything like that.
Yeah. So, by the way, the only I wasn't laughing at you when you were saying that. The only reason that I smiled was, just for your own information here. The only reason that I smiled a little bit is without you realizing it. And this is a compliment. This is not
Hit me, Jeff.
An insult. You actually veered very, very, very close to Marx's theory of materialism there, in terms of how societies are set up with a base and a superstructure. I won't go too far into that.
No, tell me.
You were very close.
Tell me.
So the basic idea there is that, and I'm not absolutely the best read guy with Marx, but probably better than most listeners of a Bitcoin podcast. The idea, Marx's general idea, was that your society was built around the means of production, of which money is one, right? So he was a little broader than you, but I gave you an example.
That's a key distinction, because for me, it's the money, it's the store of value, medium of exchange, that dictates higher level structures.
So that is a difference. And I mean, the idea of the base and the superstructure is basically, the base is, the way that your means of production are structured in a given society. And then you have a superstructure that sort of develops based upon that. So with the materialist conception of history, like the legal system, things of that nature, are all based on support for that existing system that you have in terms of the means of production. So I don't want to get too far off on that, but that's the only reason that I was smiling there for a second.
Right. Well, let me just finish off that point in perhaps an overly simplistic way, but just so that I'm clear the way I'm thinking about it. I know various forms of money were used throughout the course of history. Let's say it's 5,000 years ago in a small village, or a small civilization, they're using gold, right, as
Right.
their medium exchange. And, everyone, it's a pretty flat, organizational society. And then, everyone starts amassing surplus because of industrialization, whatever. And like, well, I've got this surplus now. I don't need it right now. That's obviously the role of money comes in there. And then if it's something like gold, well, I've got so much of it now, I need to protect it. I need to protect it personally. Our community needs to protect it. And you get layers of governance and protection and stuff that evolve on
That's
top
how
of
you
that.
got banks. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And politicians and kings and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
One of the major causes. And fast forward through a bunch of explanations so we can move along. But basically, Bitcoin flattens a lot of that because of its inherent characteristics. It doesn't require a protective. It doesn't require someone to protect it for you. And that's a massive, massive thing. Because why did armies cross borders to invade? It's to steal wealth, to steal land, to steal gold, to steal money. And so in a paradigm where the key unit of account exchange store value cannot be confiscated, that is a fundamental difference in how humans will organize, and it will dictate what structures they require to organize as optimally as possible, as efficiently as possible, as peacefully as possible. That's kind of, I could go on, but that's the general point there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is going to be relevant to the rest of what I'm going to say, but one quick point. I mean, Bitcoin's not perfectly unconfiscatable, right? I mean, it's, someone could torture you for your keys. I mean, it's still, you gave the example of armies marching to go and get gold. Well, yeah, I mean, gold was harder to protect than your keys, but both still need to be protected, right? An army can seize Bitcoin. They might not just be as efficient at it, right? But
right, but the nature
aside,
of the protection is very different, right? Like if I've got $1 trillion of gold, I
yeah,
need to have commensurate protection for that,
yeah,
with tons, armies,
mhm.
missiles, whatever time period we're talking about. If I have $1 trillion in my brain, then the protection, the ways you do it, first of all, are obviously different, but I think they could be much more on an individual level rather than
That's true.
I need a
Yep.
huge army to protect it. And
Yeah.
that is a very significant distinction.
I'm just not. The difference here is, like, I don't disagree that a decentralized, less confiscatable hard money moves us in a better direction, as you say. I'm not disagreeing with that point at all. I guess my concern is I'm not convinced. So you'll have countervailing factors, right? In other words, you've got, let's say, Bitcoin pushing us in a good direction towards decentralization. We're still going to have this economies of scale issue from technology pushing us in the other direction. And I don't feel confident enough in my prognostication ability to go all in on one of those two things. I'm comfortable with a situation where we give up some level of efficiency for safety. It's actually it's something that I consider to be a conservative approach, if that makes sense.
I get it.
And then the other part is, I mean, part of this too that I think is just important, and this is not something where you and I are going to agree tonight on, but there's a worldview issue here as well, in terms of, libertarianism is a fundamentally liberal worldview, right? In other words, and what I mean by liberal, it's an extreme liberal worldview. Essentially, when I use the word liberal, I'm using it in the true sense of the word to mean, let's say a morality, or whatever you want to call it, based on the individual. The individual is sovereign. The individual's rights and preferences are the most important thing. Capitalism is a liberal economic system, because if you take it to the libertarian extent, you're literally believing that the thing that you can't interfere with is personal commerce, right? Trade, mutually beneficial trade between individuals. I mean, that is a very, very liberal view of the world. Okay. And I even zoomed out to a 10,000 foot view. It's not even just capitalism. I think liberalism collapses on itself. When you're when you have such sort of and no one's perfectly liberal or illiberal. So I don't want to straw man, the libertarian argument here, but just for the sake of understanding what I'm saying, imagine a society that was, perfectly liberal, where we couldn't interfere with each other's choices. Essentially, what you'd have is a society where whatever in that particular society was viewed, who were the quote unquote strong, which in a capitalist society aren't even the traditional measures of strength like physical prowess or leadership or anything like that. It's just kind of the ability to come up with stuff that people want to buy, frankly, and sometimes lack of ethics, frankly, as well, in a perfectly capitalistic society. Those people, if you're saying in a perfectly liberal worldview that their preferences can't be interfered with, well, essentially what happens is you have those guys that can exercise their choices freely and do so in a way where they're to the detriment of everyone else. So liberal freedom, if you take it to that extent, right, is an illusory freedom for all but a few people. So that's what I mean when I often talk about liberalism being an Ouroboros. An Ouroboros, for those that are unfamiliar, is it's the dragon eating or snake eating its own tail, right? It sort of collapses in on itself.
Why does that have to be the case, though?
What do you mean?
Like you said, there's a few people that exercise their power over,
well, because I do believe that in any system, there's going to be a hierarchy, right? Some people are going to be better at that system than the others. And if in a perfectly liberal system, you can't interfere with the preferences and choices of the people who are at the top of that hierarchy in that given system. So
how can you not interfere with their preferences and choices?
Well, because that's the whole conceit of liberalism is that everyone's personal preferences are respected. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. You mean as some kind of state intervention system or something?
Yes, exactly.
Nobody can mess with it, right?
Nobody can mess with those preferences. So it's in their interest, if no one can mess with their preferences and they're at the guys at the top of the hierarchy that nobody can screw with.
But the market can mess with their preferences, right? That's fair game. I think what liberalism suggests is like, I'm responsible for me and I'll do what I want. I'll grant you the same rights. I won't impinge on your ability to do so.
Correct.
But on the market will certainly limit me or provide me opportunity based on all the different inputs of everybody in it.
Right. And that's, I think that's in the era in which liberalism was created as a philosophy, that may have been true or partially true or certainly more true than today. One of the big things that influences my thinking is that industrialization turns everything on its head, that it's an entirely new state of human affairs and that there have to be adjustments accordingly. I mean, to some degree, it's inarguably true, right? I mean, for instance, there was no socialism before industrialization. Socialism was a reaction to industrialization. That's why it came about as a system of political economy, right? So, I mean, it obviously was a massive change. And I think sometimes people don't recognize the degree to which these sort of economies of scale created by industrialization flip that onto its head and create opportunities to just amass levels of capital. So in a pre-industrial era, there really wasn't an efficiency advantage to you farming on your little farm and me farming on my little farm and everybody doing their own thing. But that's not the case today, right? So somebody's going to come out on top, and that's where I consider this to be self-collapsing.
So would you argue that today we're not? I know this is a tricky question. I'm not trying to trap you, but we're not better off than say 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago in terms of our individual freedom?
No, I'm not arguing I mean, there is a philosophy that you could say, like, that's Ludditism, where you completely eliminate all, your view that it's like Ted Kaczynski, right?
Right.
Have you ever read Industrial Society and Its Future?
No.
You should. It's free on the internet. It's interesting. by the way, I do not advocate sending people bombs in the mail. If anybody, lest anybody take this the wrong way, but just the thought pattern there, I think you'll get something out of it. And again, don't take this as an endorsement of the ideas in there. So I'm not a Ted Kaczynski type. I'm not a Luddite. I don't think that we should go back to living the way we were 400 or 500 years ago. I just think that, we have to make adjustments. There's been a million good things that have come about because of industrialization, right? And like any new creation of society or new system, there have been some bad parts too. And I think that we can, in fact, deal with those bad parts without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and ending up with nothing. And I'm kind of bolstered in that belief by the latter half of the 20th century, because the type of regulation in the latter half of the 20th century wasn't necessarily exactly what I would do today, but it certainly shows that, regulation in general doesn't just kill off the whole system. Because if you look at the 50s and the 60s, we had a much broader distribution of wealth and capital than we have today. I mean, it's just true, right? There's no way to sort of argue against that. And even, we don't even have to go back that far. I mean, if you just go to the pre-NAFTA era, like when I was a kid, things were much better in that regard than we are now.
But I think a lot of people would argue that at least that's partially attributed to 1971 off gold standard, government seigniorage and control of money just off the rails.
Yeah,
and
definitely is.
And it's kind of like a V shape going in different directions. That's a lot of the reason why we're in the state we're in today.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. Where was I going with this? No, that's certainly part of the issue. I'm just not so sure that it's the only thing. And I'm sort of bolstered in that by the fact that this has gotten worse. I mean, 71 was when Bretton Woods ended. Actually, the worst of things didn't really start till 2000 when we normalized trade relations with China. So I'm not persuaded that solely, the end of Bretton Woods created all these problems. It was certainly a big factor. And in fact, we couldn't even have trade with China in the way we do today if we were not on a fiat-based system. So obviously it's a factor even in terms of, other negative actions that have been taken at the government level since 1971.
Sure.
But I'm not convinced that it's the only causative factor.
No,
I'm generally suspicious of the whole one weird trick. And I'm not accusing you of using the whole one weird trick view of solving problems, but
look, I mean, I agree. It's definitely multifactorial, and as far as free trade is concerned, I think it's somewhat misguided to think that you can have long-term fair free trade while two different countries, one, have different regulations, but probably more importantly are operating on different currencies. There's just far too much ability to manipulate that arrangement, and it's just a constant battle of manipulating that arrangement via the currency or via other mechanisms. So I think if we had global free trade based on a consistent monetary standard like Bitcoin, then I think that global free trade would be far fairer and would be better for everybody in the long term. But just on the point about regulations, what is a regulation, right? It's some entity telling you that you can't do something that you want to do, or compelling you to do something that you don't want to do.
Correct.
That's what a regulation is. And I think a lot of people that come from the libertarian side of things, or the ANCAP, or that sort of stuff, would just, or ANCAP's a little bit different, of course, but would just say that let's say the market is an this is a bit of a tricky philosophical thing, but let's just say, I'll agree with you and say, the market has its own pitfalls and its own drawbacks and all the rest of it.
Just arguendo, yeah.
Right. But the question comes down to, if someone is going to be forcing me to do something, or compelling me, or forcing me to do something I don't want to do, or compelling me to do something that, or prohibiting my behavior, sorry, then who do I want the least to be doing that? What do I want? Market forces that, it's not a specific entity. It's like it's literally just market forces that are doing that, and maybe it coalesces into a group of entities that you mentioned that collude at the top. Although I'm highly skeptical that it would go down that way. Or do I want a government entity that has where there's a tremendous asymmetry of power and force to be dictating those regulations, and via those regulations imposing on my personal freedom and dictating my behavior? Which one would you rather? And I think a lot of those people would say, okay, I'm willing to concede that the market is an imperfect, governance mechanism, let's say, but I think it's better than introducing an entity that is directly going to be imposing its will on me. And at the end of that, it's a very slippery slope. I've having read your stuff and listening to, it's like, there's a role for government, and it can regulate this, but leave that alone, and it can be here and not there. But it's if history shows anything, it shows that, these concentrations of power get corrupted, coerced, co-opted, and they get used for nefarious purposes. So it's just, I feel like a lot of people on the libertarian side say, no way, man. Like I've seen this story before, and anytime we introduce a supra individual entity that has power over the individual, yes, it might work for a while. Yes, it might smooth out some bumps for a while, but long term, you get people that take that power and use the force that power that accompanies that power to impose on our freedom, and that's not what we want.
Well, all power can be abused. I'm certainly not going to argue with you there. I mean, that's one of the downsides to everything that I'm proposing. I would point out that the benefit of distributism in that regard is you're trying to create a lighter regulatory environment and instead focus more on things like antitrust, where you're keeping capital more distributed so that the market, in fact, can handle a lot of what you're talking about, and we don't have to worry about this sort of centralization and collusion. That's sort of the whole idea and method behind it. Now, that doesn't work necessarily the way it would of 100 years ago, right? Because of industrialization, there are certain entities that really do need to be big. We can talk in a minute about what I think should be the case with entities like that. But the distributists have this sort of concept that's called subsidiarity, to go to your point of, freedom imposed from above, right? Subsidiarity is sort of this idea that all sort of authority or power should be exercised at the lowest level at which it's effective. And people misinterpret this to mean that, to take it as sort of a libertarian concept, right? Because what's the lowest level other than the individual? Well, the problem is that if you move all power to the level of the individual, that's an illusory freedom that actually, in fact, impairs individual freedom in aggregate. And what I mean, and that kind of goes to what I spoke about before, where, in a perfectly liberal society where we have only focus on the individual, there's going to be dominance by some over others. So the solution to that problem, a subsidiarist solution to that problem, is that you devolve power. Instead of power being devolved from the top to the bottom, power is devolved from the bottom to the top, and only enough power such that the minimum amount of power necessary to preserve that freedom at the lower levels. That's how subsidiarity works. Can that be abused? Is that a slippery slope? It absolutely is. But I don't know of a better solution than to attempt to do that, because I think it's been pretty clear by history of specifically the past 20 or 30 years that failure to do that and to go in this more, neoliberal free market direction has reduced the freedom of most people in society today. And when I say reduce their freedom, I mean predominantly their economic freedom, right? They have less employment opportunities than before. Their wages are way too low. And at the end of the day, a living wage is pretty much one of the most important material conditions that you need in order for people to enjoy freedom and agency in their daily lives.
Sure, but I would argue that the gap between, wage growth and cost of living have diverged primarily as a function of what government has done to the money. One of the things with, about inflation, everyone always talks about, the 2%, the 3% year, that's the hidden tax of inflation. But, what people don't talk about as often is that the implication of an inflation target and what that means for subsuming productivity gains, right? So, obviously the CPI is calculated in a very, odd
Right.
way, and most people don't think it actually represents, the
Real inflation,
true
sure.
inflation. And of course, it suggests that inflation is a function of rising prices rather than increase in the money supply, which is obviously a debate as well. But if you had every, obviously over the last 30 years, there's been tremendous productivity gains. If we're talking auto sector, if we're talking, consumer goods and electronics, like, things have become more efficient. And that's primarily been driven by technological advancement. And what targeting 2% means basically is, like, no matter how much the productivity gain is in a given year or period of time, let's just say for argument's sake, it's 10% or 20%. Having that target in place means you're going to basically erase that gain and just still make sure that prices are increasing by 2% a year, right? Because we're using the CPI to target inflation. So, and who skims that off the top? Of course, it's the government. That it's almost like the productivity gains get monetized immediately at source by the government, and they get to all the benefit accrues to them. So, I think if the government didn't control the money, we would see, declining prices and then stabilizing prices. And then, whether wages stagnated, stayed the same, or, when increased a little bit, great. But I think that would normalize over time. And of course, this is my faith in free market and free market money with that. But the government's intervention has totally fucked that. And, to your point about whether, now it's more laissez-faire capitalist than it's ever been via deregulation or whatever. I mean, I'm not up enough on, the policies over the last 20 years to comment on that, but I think I can pretty confidently say that government has grown in size over, it keeps growing and growing. And I think that just creates an ever greater, not only their control of the money, but just the fact that there's more people directly employed by the government. That creates perversions and market distortions that are a net negative for the economy.
Yeah, but a lot of that growth was in fact necessary due to the increasing freedom in the market, right? Because again, sort of as these markets get, quote unquote, freer and freer, we've seen greater centralizations of capital, and we've seen extreme changes in the balance of power between labor and capital. That's a big factor here. So both, the nature of technology obviously devalues labor, period. And then if you combine that with the fact that employers have more power than ever over labor for a few reasons. Number one, they can simply just move if they don't like the price or conditions that are required for labor in a given market. They can just move in most industries, everything other than service industries. They can just move to another country and employ people in sort of deplorable conditions if need be. So that's number one. And then number two is our legal system here, and this is sort of tied to number one, really. Our legal system here in the United States is no longer favorable, let's say, towards unionization. And that's a lot of that is tied to the free trade stuff as well. I mean, unionization has collapsed in the United States over the past 20 to 30 years. And with that collapsing unionization, what we've seen is, I mean, the point of a union is it allows labor to form cartel power against capital, right? I mean, that's the whole point of it. And as they've lost that cartel power, they're in a more precarious situation than they've been in, any time during my life. All those things are going to combine along with, what you said about fiat money. When you combine that all together, you're going to end up with wages that are not very high. And while the whole fiat factor, let's say, is certainly a factor in that, I am certainly not willing to bet the farm that it's the only factor, and this is just going to magically fix itself in the event that the money worked out. Then part of that is because I don't believe the market is particularly anything special. I just think it's a tool for allocation of resources, but it's not a perfect tool, and I don't ascribe any sort of, and I'm not saying you do, but any sort of like mythical or magical abilities to it or anything of that nature. I don't think it does anything other than optimize for efficient production. Other than that, I don't think that it really does.
Yeah, I think it optimizes for efficient production and resource allocation, but I also think it's an expression of freedom, and that's pretty important. Now, I can assume how you might push back on that, but I just think, this discussion boils down to a pretty, basic philosophical argument, is that, do we want to optimize for freedom of the individual, or do we want to say, no, because when we get together in big enough numbers, things get tangly and we need to intervene, and the we is the key component there. We need to intervene to make it all work. And the problem with people that are on the former side of that argument say, yeah, but who's the we? And what's going to happen when that we has the ability to intervene? That's power. And what happens to that power? It corrupts. Right. So that's the nature of, like, do you have faith in human beings to organize freely and accept what comes of that? Or do you think, no, we need to intervene so that it all works together? And then, like I said, the who's the we?
Right. So not being a liberal, I have more faith in that what you're referring to as a we. And in terms of who are the we, that's sort of one of the major points of distributism, is we want to make that we as broad as possible. And that power that you're talking about exercising as broad as possible. I mean, could it still be abused? Of course, all power can be abused, but you want to limit abuse in that way. It's sort of the whole point of it.
But isn't that the problem? You make it as broad as possible, then everyone wants to be included in the we, because the we is the people who have differential asymmetric power in any sort of society or structure. And then if everybody's the we, then you're back in the same place, because there's no, no part of that organism can impose anything on the other.
You're never going to have everyone be the we, right? And that's why it's not necessarily a perfect philosophy. You stumbled sort of into Marx there a little bit again too, which is why I laughed again. So his critique of what he called like more reactionary forms of socialism, or what he called like bourgeois socialism, was that instead of that, their goal was always to create a bourgeoisie without a proletariat, which goes exactly to what you said. In other words, that would be an unworkable situation when everyone sort of becomes the we. And I sort of accept the fact that it's unfortunate that not everyone, you're never going to have a completely flat society. I don't believe that is sort of in accordance with human nature, including the darker portions of human nature.
100%. I'm not suggesting that. For sure.
But no, I know you're not. I think you're suggesting the exact opposite.
Right.
Yeah. So where was I going with this here?
Sorry.
Oh, no, not a problem. So my point is, we can still do better. And by having as many competing interests as possible in that, if you want to call it the we, the people that have disproportionate amount of power in society, by having a larger number of competing interests in that quote unquote we can do a better job with reducing abuse. Now, like anything, that could be taken to its extreme, and what's its extreme is liberalism, where everyone is in the we in liberalism, right? There is nobody can impose anything on anybody else. It's that that sort of, I don't want to use the word fetishization, that's mean, but it's that sort of holding up of the individual as being sovereign above all else. And I just think that for the reasons we talked about, I guess earlier, is sort of an illusory type of freedom. And by the way, if you want, I can talk more specifically about different things that I think would be a good idea.
I would like to hear that. So hold that thought, but I just want to comment, because, just two conversations ago, or at the beginning of this one, you were saying that, technology is what drives the efficiency improvements, which is what drives the power into the control of the people that own capital and drives down the price of labor and stuff like that. But and of course I understand that argument, but isn't that the kind of the same argument when cars came around and people making horseshoes were saying like this is going to destroy everything? And obviously in today's day and age, automation is talked about a lot, robots replacing people. And so I think there's two ways you can go, right? People can say it's going to drive down the cost of labor, it's going to be tons of unemployment, capital is going to concentrate. The other people say it's going to free up a lot of humans. There's going to be other opportunity as a result of the technological innovation and advancement in industries that are born out of that automation. And just as happened with the horseshoes and the cars, this is how we push human technological advancement and humanity forward. This is the process of becoming a more technologically advanced civilization.
Right, but I mean, I guess my point is you can you can free people up. That's always going to happen. There's always going to be automation that is, as you say, going to free people up. But I fear that we do eventually get to a point where we got a lot of, quote unquote, free people and not enough stuff for them to do, which is fine in the event that, there's two different ways that this whole productivity thing can go. And this actually goes to something you tweeted about recently. So if you're becoming more productive, you need less labor. And as you said, you're freeing up more human beings. Keynes thought what would happen is that the way you'd make up for that is everybody would just be working like 15 hours a week, right? And they would essentially that people would be getting paid like a living wage to work 15 hours a week. 15 hours was the number he used. It doesn't really matter. They would just have, people would have a lot more leisure time, but they'd still be earning like this nice living wage. That was his prediction. And of course he was very wrong about that, right? The opposite happened. The labor market became more cutthroat than ever. People have to work more to try to get ahead because there are less slots, less opportunity, because all of those productivity gains have, instead of being passed on to labor, have gone almost entirely to the holders of capital. That's just an observation. You could talk about that. The fiat money has a lot to do with that. I don't doubt that it does have a lot to do with that, but I'm not so sure that it's the only thing that's driving that. I think technology itself and just the way that the market naturally works in the presence of enhanced efficiency has a lot to do with that in its very nature. And trust me, I wish that we were in a situation where those productivity gains had gone down to the workers so that people were earning a living wage to work less hours instead of, the reverse where we just drove down wages instead. But this is the situation that we're in right here and right now. And that's the situation that we have to deal with as a society.
But I do think, and I know you just paid lip service to that, I do think a lot of that has to do with the money. But the other thing about the collusion argument is that if, I certainly think hierarchies will develop. And let's say we're on a sounder monetary standard. Let's say we're on a Bitcoin standard and, productivity gains are not being robbed from people. Wages are more consistent with productivity growth, all the rest of it. Of course, there's going to be some people who are like, yo, I'm cool with working 20 hours a week and I got my house and I got my family. It's cool. And there's going to be hyper competitive people that want to work 80 hours a week still because they want more. They're, and they will achieve higher levels on the hierarchy of wealth and all the rest of it. And I don't see anything wrong with that at all. But the problem with the collusion argument, I feel, is like if the collusion is so total, right? If it actually is as effective as you're suggesting, and they've colluded to such a degree that they have a stranglehold on all the primary goods and services that anybody might need in a market, which again is quite an assumption. But let's say that's the case, then they stop being competitively minded. If you've got a stranglehold on the market, you're not thinking how do we come out with the next best thing and beat this and beat that. You're saying, no, we can chill. We got everything on lock. And so at some point, someone else in the market in which you're operating, someone that you're not aware of, that's not a competitor, they will innovate and they will do something better than you're doing it, and they will start to get market share. And then it'll be slow at first, and then all at once. And Bitcoin is kind of a great example of that. But just in general, I think collusion means complacency. And somewhere in a market, especially of this size and dynamism that we have all over the world today, with as many people and many products and services, that people will develop solutions that are better than those complacent colluders, and they will get market share. And you may argue, well, they'll get bought up and this or that, but it's the weeds that keep popping up, or that alligator game that you keep trying to hit them down, but they keep popping up. Like, I feel that is the benefit of free markets, and that's what causes the churn at the top.
But you're making a big assumption that once we got to that servile state situation, what Balak would call the servile state, that anyone would be able to ever acquire enough capital in order to do what you just said, in order to innovate. And
how could it ever get there if that was happening the entire time? Like, people are always going to be competing and innovating. Doesn't matter if it's at the beginning of that process or at the end.
Historically, what has happened is you have a period of high innovation that a smaller number of producers win. And then at that point, what we've seen historically is the government's had to step in to break it up. It hasn't been a situation where, the trusts in the early 20th and late 19th century are the classic example, right?
Tell me how the trusts work, because I'm not as familiar with it.
So that the Gilded Age is typically held up as sort of this, by libertarians, as sort of this great era, because there was mass technological advancement, during that era. The trusts were essentially these, like, literally this wasn't even informal collusion. I mean, this was literally on paper groups of organizations that it was called a trust that would collude together.
Like the oil trust and the railway and that kind of shit?
Exactly, right. All that sort of stuff. And the way that the trust system ended in the U.S. was Roosevelt stepped in and broke them up. And that's why we have antitrust law today. That's why it's called antitrust law, going back to that era. So I think it's pretty much the natural, with industrialization, that's sort of the natural arc. And if what you said was true, so I'll give you this. There's certainly an argument that you might have a situation where you get up to that point, where capital is very heavily concentrated. If they don't realize that they need to, there's two things can happen. They don't realize that they need to collude, and they compete with each other. And then we're in a capitalist paradox situation where they're driving down wages to the point where there's no more demand, and they create a recession or depression. And that recession or depression will, in fact, break up capital ownership. It will redistribute capital ownership. It's a really ugly way to do that, but that will work. Or they realize they need to collude because they've seen, hey, the last time some guys were in this situation in the industrial era, they didn't do this, and look where they ended up. They're gone now, and that's why we're the guys on top now, because they were too stupid to figure this out. And that's going to pretty much marshal them into collusion, at least for a long period of time. If it's not permanent, as I think that it might be, or there's a risk that it would be, sort of that servile state situation, then, and I don't mean literal permanence, there could be small changes here and there still within a servile type system. In other words, you could have like a reasonably small number of conglomerates that might at any given time be competing with each other in certain new technological advancements. But then, once somebody sort of won out in that particular market, that competition was done, and then they would just compete on the next new thing that they come up with. But it's still only that same group of conglomerates competing with each other in each successively new market, which, by the way, some people don't think is a bad situation. I do. I value, personal agency enough to think that that is bad, but, that is a potential belief system there. I lost my train of thought there for a second. Sorry again.
I'll just jump in then. And this, not a perfect response to what you just said, but, when you were saying that, I was thinking the other, there's many different things that, change the nature of this conversation, the historical moment we're in, all that kind of stuff. But,
yeah,
I like to think of technologies that allow human beings to be independent, right? And we're entering an age where, more and more technologies are bringing the quote unquote means of production, the possibility of bringing them down to an individual level, right? So
Yeah.
if I have my off the grid home, I have my citadel in the forest somewhere in northern Canada, for example, then I have access to water. I can grow my own food. I can generate my own energy. I can do a lot of things as an individual, right? And to what degree will, and of course, I know we're not there yet, but like, let's say, people, more and more people, and I think you can make a case that Bitcoin is inspiring this in people, are developing a more independently minded attitude and vision for themselves, and are saying that I want to mitigate or decrease my dependencies wherever they exist, whether it's on the medical system, whether it's on energy, whether it's on water or essential services or whatever, and then they're it's almost like they're more impervious to anyone who would like to collude and gain control over them. You know what I'm saying?
Well, the problem is all that sort of subsistence. I know you don't literally mean subsistence, but subsistence type future that you mentioned there. To do all that stuff, you'd need very advanced technological tools. And the people that develop those tools, if there are a small number of producers in the economy, those are going to be the people that are going to have tremendous power over society, right? A level of power with which I'll give you the example. Like someone once asked me, like, well, what about a post-scarcity society where technological advancement just gets so far that we don't have scarcity anymore? Why would we have to worry about this? And I think that's almost the time where you most need to worry about this, because the people that control the technology that created that post-scarcity society then almost have perfect or absolute power.
Right. They're like gods then.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I don't think this whole abundance thing, not sure I buy into that, because I think we're always just going to move the goalposts as people and as a civilization. We're going to say, oh, we have everything we want on Earth. Yeah, but what about that planet over there? Let's go do the same thing over there.
Sure.
So I don't think we'll ever get to that stage. But, to your point about people that control these technologies, I mean, if we're going to have the real argument, like you can do that now. It's still primitive, like 3D printers are primitive and all the rest of it. But like you could be an independent living human and survive pretty comfortably right now. And so once these, and this is developing rapidly and these technologies are improving rapidly, is the window of opportunity closing for the type of power dynamic that you're not proposing, but that you're describing and trying to avert? Because if more and more people take personal responsibility, and I know that's a big if, because there's lots of, we live in a society where many people abdicate their personal responsibility and willingly give it over to many different, service providers or other people. But if for people that wanted to do that, if it happened en masse, how could you be under the thumb of people if you're literally independent in almost every regard, and which you could construct for yourself right now?
Well, I mean, you still need a decent amount of capital to be able to do that, right? I mean, like,
sure.
If you're,
but you have the opportunity to gain that capital now, right? We're not
some
like
people do. Some people
sure,
do.
Sure,
I'd argue that most people don't. But there's obviously a number of people that have the ability to do that right now. I don't think that most people do not, and the people that have the amount of capital to be able to do that are probably the least likely to do so, because they're the ones that are doing pretty well in the current system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the upper classes. So I don't see that as sort of throwing a wrench in the scenario that I kind of laid out there.
Right. Fair enough. All right, let's go back a few minutes. You said I can propose a solution, or like I can propose what I see as a solution for all
as potential solutions, because at the end of the day, I mean, distributism is basically just using the legal system in such a way that you want to decentralize the ownership of capital, right? The solutions that were proposed in, like, Servile State was written in 1912. Most of the stuff was written in the 1910s through the end of the 1920s. It really wouldn't be applicable today. Like, for instance, one of the main solutions that Block and Chesterton would talk about is like, oh, we could take unemployed people in the cities, and we could just give them plots of land in the countryside and they could become subsistence farmers. Well, that's not really practical, right, in the 21st century. So you have to be willing, I guess, in a lot of ways, I think, to sort of incrementally, because I am very much an conservative and an incrementalist in this way, throw things at the wall and see if they stick, and go little by little. So what are some examples, right? Things that we could do right off the bat would be like trade changes. We didn't have this like nearly as free of a trade 30 years ago versus today. We know it's not some crazy disaster not to have completely free trade. We can't go back to that old system immediately. Unfortunately, we're too tied into countries like China today for that to happen. Honestly, one of the reasons I like Bitcoin so much is because the massive trade deficit that we run with China, in fact, is only made possible through fiat currency. So without a fiat currency, that deficit would have to shrink over time, and our dependence on China, the necessity of dependence on China would have to shrink over time, and maybe we could start to sort of disentangle ourselves and bring some more industry back to the United States.
Could you just explain a tiny bit about why the trade deficit would not be possible with Bitcoin?
It's because of balance of payments. So ultimately, so here's what happens, right? If I want to buy something from China, I have to buy it with the yuan, right? So essentially, what happens here is dollars go to. There's a flow of currency. Forget about actually dollars and yuan. Yeah. There's a flow of currency from the United States to China, right? That money is then leaving and going to China. So what has to happen? So if for the U.S. to keep demanding, to have money to keep buying stuff from China, speaking of the balance of payments, therefore the Chinese have to be buying stuff from the United States, right? I mean, that's just simple math. If all the money is leaving the United States, imagine it was gold. If all our gold is leaving the United States and going to China, there's going to be a natural limiter on that due to the fact that we're not going to have any more gold anymore. We're not going to be able to buy anything, right? So that system can't just sort of go on forever and ever and ever. So how do you deal with that? What happens? Like, how is this working right now? Well, the only way that deficit can be propped up in the current time is that we have to, in a fiat system, print more money. Now, normally, the money printing would also even still eventually balance itself out due to the fact that we would have to keep printing more dollars to send to China. China would be then selling those extra dollars for its own currency, right? Therefore, driving down the value of the dollar. As the value of the dollar continued to fall, production in China is now not nearly as comparatively efficient. You'd be better off producing things in the United States since the dollar's become so cheap. So even with a pure fiat system, there's even some degree of a balancing mechanism there. The reason that doesn't happen in the current era is there's essentially a tacit agreement between China and the United States because China wants to keep exporting and the U.S. doesn't want to have to rein in its spending because obviously spending is a part of this equation as well. So what essentially happens is the Chinese take all of their dollars and instead of selling them, which would lower the value of the dollar, they buy treasury bonds, which allows the United States to keep printing more and more money. So that's why we're so intertangled with China. Our entire deficit funding mechanism relies on the fact that the Chinese have all these profits from exporting to the United States that because they don't want their money to appreciate in value because then that export market is going to be cut off for them.
Right.
They reinvest in treasury bonds in the United States or in the U.S. financial system in general. They also buy like U.S. securities, Wall Street products,
sure,
things like that. That's why we've had financialization in the United States since 2000. The only part of the economy that's actually booming is the fake part of the economy, all these financial products, because that's where the money goes.
Right. You take the cheap jobs, just make sure you invest it all back in our economy or in our financial sector, and we're good.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's basically an agreement where we'll send you all our well-paying blue collar jobs in exchange for like you propping up our financial sector.
Right. And
it's
cheap
horrible
goods for consumers.
Yeah, right. And that was supposedly why it all works out, right? We ruin people's lives and jobs, but they'll be able to buy stuff real cheap, so they'll be okay. Hasn't worked out so well. There's a lot of problems with that. I'm not even going to get into that right now. So, you know, a different way to look at trade, tariffs that are based on for also environmental conditions in a given country. Both environmental and labor conditions in a given country would be tremendously beneficial. Right. Other policies that are obviously, you know, designed to increase wages. Although I don't believe unions are the ultimate end game, and I'll get to what I think the end game are in a minute. In the meantime, absolutely, I favor card check. You're probably not familiar with that. Card check is basically it's an easier way to form a union. Right now in the United States, if you want to form a union, the way it works is you circulate these signature cards around the workplace. 30% of the employees sign the cards, 30% or more. There's an election, right? The employer becomes aware at that time that this is going on. There's an election where the employees then will have a vote to determine whether or not a union is formed. The problem with that is the reality of that situation is that the employees, therefore, the employer knows what's going on and basically can do a bunch of sketchy stuff in terms of threatening the employees to try and stop the union from forming. Right. That's basically the issue. With card check, basically you can skip the election if you get 50% of the employees to sign cards. So basically 50% of the employees sign cards, they bring them to the employer. That's it. The employer is legally required to recognize the union at that point. So it's an easier method of unionization. That unionization in general, I think, it's not a permanent solution, but it at least gets wages up in the meantime. And I consider it very important for that reason. Ultimately, what I would like to see in larger enterprises that can't be decentralized, right? Like you're not going to have like your local, I can't even think of a giant business right now, but it's technology companies, right? Some of these are there's not going to be one of those in every town. That's not going to be a thing. You know what I mean? Antitrust or not, that's just, there's always going to be a smaller number of certain companies that operate in a market where economies of scale are really great.
Right.
For companies of like that, in the short term, I favor a co-determination system, which is Germany does this. This is a system where.
Can I just jump in for 1 sec before, we'll peg that we're on Germany and co-determination, but just about you know, I had a conversation with a friend recently, and you know, he's starting this new business, technology, you know, agricultural technology, and you know, he, you know, is a I don't want to mischaracterize it, but anyways, what he wanted to do was pay everybody the same regardless of what their position was, right? And I was like, well, you know, obviously you're relying on people to be very like to have other perhaps altruistic reasons for being involved in this venture, because otherwise they would just go out and get their market price for their labor. Whether you're an engineer or a janitor, there's a market price for the labor. And if you're paying, you know, the janitor the same as your engineer, you're going to have a tough go of business. And if you're paying the engineer the same amount as your janitor, well, he'll just go out and find a higher paying job somewhere else.
Sure.
But and then, you know, it got into this sort of talk of minimum wage and legislating and regulating these sorts of things. And what I always come back to is, in a free market, right?
Right.
People that want to unionize their labor, and you can structure a business, a company, a group of people who have certain skills and represent a certain group of labor, however you like, right? That's the beauty of being out. And then it can see. Then we can all see, if you want to operate that way, you operate that way, and the chips fall where they may. My issue is that in the case of a union, right? You say, okay, everyone's agreed that they want to the card check you were just describing over 50%. Okay, now the employer has to, adopt the union, and what that means is that they have to pay more for their labor, and then that what means is that they have to charge more for their services.
Absolutely.
Right, and what that means is that they're distorting the pure market regulating factor of the value they're providing and what they're receiving in return.
Correct.
And that will have a self-imposed limit at a certain stage, right? Because they'll keep having, what they have to charge more for their services, the added gain of that enforced higher compensation for the union is less and less effective over time, because the things that are being made are increasing in price as a result of that enforcement of that wage. And then you just get this, constantly they it's a downward spiral, I guess you could say, or an upward spiral, depending on what way you're looking at it. But that the effect becomes, over time, it's counterproductive to what they were trying to achieve in the first place. So if they had just let pure market mechanisms dictate what the cost of that particular labor was for that particular job, rather than dictating supramarket that this labor is worth this much and that company must pay that labor, because all that's going to happen is the market will adjust to that intervention and that perversion that's been created by the enforcement entity, which is obviously the government. And so that it will just, of course, it can go on for, it's not happen immediately. It can go on for a period of time, but it's counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, historically, what's that didn't happen though.
And that's why we see what, sorry to the last point on that. That's why we see what we talked about earlier, where wage growth is not consistent with price increases.
Right, but I mean, that's what unionization does by boosting up wages. It typically does not all of that is typically actually passed on in part of it is obviously passed on as higher prices, but more likely what's going to happen is it's passed on in the form of lower dividends, lower stock prices.
Is that likely though? I mean,
are
the decision makers at the top more likely to say, we'll pay ourselves less, or say, pass it on to?
Well, by your own admission there, they are in a competitive market, so they're not going to be able to, pass 100% of those costs back on to the employer.
Sure. Well, even if it's 50% or 25%, it's still
it's something,
towards
but
the same
they're
place.
Still better off. If it's less than 100%, they're better off.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, it's a market distortion, but I think that's good, right? Because I don't think the market optimizes for wages. So I'm all about distorting the market in areas where it doesn't optimize for wages.
But what about something like a minimum wage?
I mean, the minimum wage is fine. It's not something that I oppose.
But how could you ever determine what, like, the precise, with all the data inputs in a market, what it should be, especially when it's coming from a federal level and it's being in all the different states and markets?
Those are the imperfections in it, right? And I don't look, the situation we're in today, people are so desperate that I certainly don't oppose it. Is it the best solution? No. Some of the stuff, if you let me go on a little bit further,
sure.
I think are going to be better solutions. Unionization is better than relying on unionization to increase wages is better than relying on a minimum wage for that reason, because that's an agreement. The minimum wage then becomes an agreement negotiated between the union, which is on one hand, and the employer on the other. It is a negotiation in that case between employer and employee. The only difference is the employees are forming a cartel to maximize their leverage. That's the only difference in that scenario. So right. It's not a market wage in the way that you might consider a market wage, but it's more of a market wage than a minimum wage is, let's say.
Yeah, fair enough. But
the ultimate idea, I think you're going to see where I'm going here. This will tie back into the union thing, right? So, unions are a way that we provide people relief right now. They're not perfect for a variety of reasons, but they're going to make a lot of people's lives a lot better almost immediately. And then from unions, I think the next step from there is we start looking at this co-determination stuff, where once your business has reached a certain size, which is to some degree arbitrary, but like a lot of things, we have to make arbitrary decisions. That's where you have to give your employees a voice on the board of directors. They become involved in employee governance. And at that point, it's absolutely the case that this company is no longer run entirely for the benefit of the shareholders. There's a back and forth between shareholders and employees at that point. And the ultimate goal, the last stage of that, if you're looking at this from an incrementalist perspective, what I would like to see is a scenario where maybe your small and medium-sized businesses continue as is, private ownership, but these large entities, the entities that I'm talking about being the entities that would be required to be in a co-determination system, eventually become co-ops. I don't know if you're familiar with like Mondragon. Have you heard of that company? Okay, so they're based in Spain. They're a very, very large global conglomerate. They manufacture a million different types of things, everything from appliances to spare parts to all kinds of stuff. And they have no shareholders. They're governed entirely by and for their own employees. So that would be, if you were to ask me what my best case scenario would be over a
so the employees are the
period.
Shareholders?
Well, they don't shareholder, sort of, if you want to think of it that way.
It's a legal entity, right? Somebody has to own it.
It's a legal entity. Yeah, exactly. It's a legal entity. It's a legal entity where governance is handled entirely by the employees. And I won't get into the real gritty details of the governance structure because I don't remember them off the top of my head right this second. I'd have to look at them myself because it is a little bit complicated. The different divisions have their own governance structures, and then there's a council at the top. There's even separate councils that represent the employees as owners versus the employees as employees. And again, I'm not prepared to go entirely into that, but that's the idea of.
I just fail to see
how that works.
Why that's preferable. Shareholders and employers, obviously, first of all, they save capital or they access capital in some way, and then they deploy that capital to do many things. But one of the things that they do is they make a laborer's labor more valuable, obviously, right? So absent the factory that makes the car,
right,
that labor is not worth $100 an hour. Maybe it's worth $10 an hour for picking apples off the trees or whatever. But the person who's put up the capital investment and who has, the intellectual capital and all the other things that go in to making a system that can actually leverage the value, like enhance the value of labor, right? So it's not like labor has an inherent value. It has a market value depending on what it kind of plugs into in terms of the work it's doing. And so why is it, and the people that the shareholders and the employers there, they do all of that in order to provide goods and services in the most efficient way to the market. Right. And the more they're able to do that, like the more that capital inflows and they get profits and they invest them back into the market in order to expand operations or to research and development or to any of this kind of stuff. Why is it more preferable to have everybody be an owner? Like, obviously, that's not how it started. Why? I just don't understand.
Why is it preferable?
Yeah.
They're going to work in better conditions, have higher wages, have more agency over their daily life.
Are they though? Why would they? Just because they're all owners? And like, again, back to my previous argument, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot because they're destroying the entity that gave them the opportunity to value their labor.
Well, there's still an executive team. There's still an executive team, but that executive team is elected by the employees themselves. It's not as if there's no executive structure at all. That would be obviously a nightmare. The organization wouldn't be able to run.
No, I get it, but it's like, what, like the owners and the shareholders, why is it bad that they're creating an entity that's allowing labor to be valued more than it otherwise would be? Why is that insufficient as far as the labor is concerned? For example, if someone started a factory across the street from where I am right now, and $2 an hour was their rate, and somebody willingly said, sure, I'll spend my time working for $2 an hour. and they make that free exchange, then that's a benefit to the person making the $2 an hour, because they otherwise their labor wouldn't have been valued that way. And it's a benefit to the employer because they're getting access to labor that they need to make their products and services. What's wrong with that relationship?
What's wrong with a relationship where, okay, I kind of lost track of, because you went a couple different directions there. I mean, well, I'll go to this. Your main conceit there was, why is it preferable to for say a cooperative structure versus a shareholder corporate structure, right? Is that the question we're trying to get at here?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it depends on what you're trying to optimize for here. If you're trying to optimize for, well, I mean, I guess not. Forget that for a second. I mean, if we're talking about a situation where you're saying, what are the benefits? Well, people clearly are going to have a higher wage, right? Like, because the sort of surplus, the profits, if you will, instead of accruing to a small number of people at the top, they're going to accrue across a very, very broad group of people. This is a method of decentralization.
But then there's less capital left at the top to expand, grow, survive, compete, innovate, and that may shorten the life of the enterprise.
Assuming that they are that the executive team elected by the employees is necessarily going to be higher time preference than a bunch of shareholders are. I don't agree with that statement at all. Shareholders can't look past usually 90 days. That's how corporations work. Whereas employees know that they're going to need this job going forward. And experience,
Yeah, but the premise is that they're being paid more than their market rate. So right off the bat, that's my point, is that more money is being paid out in the form of wages. That means less money is going to be made available to invest back in the business.
No, it doesn't mean that, because the shareholders have to get paid in a corporation. So the surplus that would go to the shareholders is, instead of going to shareholders, goes to the employees.
They don't have to. If the company was in a really tight competitive environment, right? The shareholders could say, invest it all back into the business. Don't pay out a dividend. Don't do whatever. And
your assumption here is that employees would be higher time preference than shareholders. That's the assumption that this all hinges on.
What do you mean?
Because
all I'm just saying is that the money that the extra money that the supermarket wage that they're earning is taking money away from the business.
So there's a surplus, right? Let's just call it a surplus that can either go to extra wages or shareholder dividends or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't want to get into technicalities, but in a co-op, part of what they earn is a wage and part is a dividend. We can collapse that into just wage for purposes of our discussion, because it's going to the employees either way. Mm. So that surplus in a corporation, shareholders, when they're for reinvestment and growth, have to be willing to not take that surplus up front, right? In other words, they have to be willing to delay. It's a time preference issue. They have to be willing to have a low enough time preference that they're willing not to take that surplus up front in the form of dividends. We agree there, right?
Sure.
Okay. So employees are no different. Employees, like I said, they're usually, the way these co-ops are structured, there's their basic wage, and then there's something akin to a dividend that they receive on top of that, depending on the company's performance and, ability to pay and all this different stuff. There's no reason to believe that employees sitting in that scenario would have any higher of a time preference than shareholders. And in fact, based on real world experience with Mondragon, and also just the way shareholders act, I would actually allege the opposite. It's the employees need this company to keep going. Shareholders, it's whatever, as long as I sold my shares at the right time and I timed it right, doesn't matter to me, as long as I wasn't the guy holding the bag at the end. So I don't buy at all that employees sitting in that position would act in a higher time preference way than shareholders
But isn't
would.
the whole premise of like unions and stuff like that is that they're actually prioritizing their own wage growth than
With a union, they would, which is why. So a union is a fundamentally combative situation, right? Because the union and the employer are on opposite ends; they're at loggerheads, right?
Mhm.
If you eventually get to the point where you're in a co-op, and I just gave you sort of a 3-step way to get there. Unions are step 1, co-determination step 2, the co-op is step 3. Once you've gotten to the level of a co-op, that antagonistic relationship is no longer there. They have a direct responsibility in hand in the operation of the business day to day and in its ultimate success or failure. So at that point, there isn't that natural antagonism. And in fact, Mondragon numerous times in its history, and this is a huge company that sells stuff all over the world, the employees have in fact voted to cut their own wages and payouts when market conditions have dictated such.
how
So
does a co-op form in the first place? Like why did the original investors or owners give up so much
but
power and
it
ownership?
was formed as a co-op from the beginning in Spain. It was formed basically based on the premises of Catholic social teaching
Right.
at that time to try and rebuild the economy in that region of Spain after the war. So it began that way from the beginning.
Mhm.
How we're actually going to transition, from co-determination to a co-op, the only thing, that's a great question. I think there's gonna be some trial and error there. In the beginning, I'd like to see a situation where, um, you know, there would be a legal structure in which there'd be a smooth buyout of shareholders from employees. Like they'd have to carry some debt for a while, right? Um, and exactly the ins and outs of how exactly that would work, I think it's too early to know. But that's what I would see as a future. That's a best case scenario. We have a situation where there's a mechanism in place by which employees can buy out the shareholders, and that there's also a legal mechanism in place such that new co-ops are able to form and receive funding. Not when I say funding, not necessarily like a grant, but a streamlined way for them to receive financing like any other startup business. So we'll see. And I would favor incentivizing that through the tax code as well. In other words, for-profit corporations should be put at a tax disadvantage to co-ops. Absolutely.
Right.
100%.
I just don't see either why, co-ops in which, the employees are also the owners, like why would we expect them to make better decisions for the life and development of the business than people who actually, like everyone's not equal in their ability, and
Yeah,
people
but I don't
like,
care if they're making what shareholders are morons though. They're still electing
well,
shareholders are still electing an executive team just like employees would. And shareholders don't give a crap about the underlying business. They just care about whether the shares are going to be worth more in 2 weeks when they sell. Like
which is highly, well, it depends what type of shareholder we're talking about. But if you're a long-term shareholder, how much money you make is very tightly correlated to how well the business does generally, right?
maybe.
In
I'm
general
not
terms,
really
like
particularly convinced of that.
if the business does poorly, your shares are probably going to be worth less. I mean,
Maybe
pretty
sometimes
standard.
that's far from that's very far from universal, as
Right,
we
but
could see,
how are your shares worth more if that's not true?
because people are just willing to buy them. It's
Right,
stock
but
market's
over a
kind
long enough
of a
time
shell
period,
game. Yeah.
sure, the stock market's manipulated. I get all that, but over a long enough time period, you own shares in the business because you think it's going to grow and do well, and the value you'll accrue to you as a result of owning shares in that business, right?
Uh, yeah, you just think your shares are going to be worth more in the future than they are today.
Right, and usually the underlying assumption is because the business is going to do well.
Eh, I don't agree with that. It's
You
usually
don't
just
think that's
because
usually the underlying assumption?
no, I think it's more so just that shares usually trade on like news and expectations and things like that. It's not necessarily.
But short-term traders for sure. But if like we're saving for your 401k and you buy Apple in 2000, that's not a short-term trade. You're thinking Apple's big company, probably going to be around, probably going to still do well. I want some of that value.
Yeah, I mean, I'll concede that you think that they're going to exist and be able to continue to be profitable enough to pay you, right? To eventually pay dividends, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah. I mean, I'll concede that point, but employees have the same motivation. They want to keep their job, so they need to get paid on a day-to-day basis as well.
I just feel like all this is so tangly, and I think this is part of the problem that we're in today. Is that with extremely large governments trying to micromanage the economy on every single level, it's like you can never acquire and synthesize enough data to do that properly, and it's always just going to be tweaking this and tweaking that and creating perversions here and there, when the free market literally does that without any work.
The co-op,
I start a company, I provide a job at a certain price. 99% of the people say, fuck that, I'm worth more than that. 1% says, yeah, cool, that's a fair trade for me. And it's done. Like doesn't have to be any further negotiating or nitpicking or tweaking or regulations or anything. But when you start introducing that stuff, I just feel like you'll be doing it forever, and it will constantly, it never reaches an appropriate equilibrium, and it'll always create inefficiencies, and it's always going to need more management to the point of micromanagement. And I think we'll see bureaucratic bloat on an individual company level, as we're seeing on a government level today, until
why would there be more bloat in a co-op than first of all, I just want to be clear that I don't think that small businesses, it's probably efficient to run this way. I'm talking about, or even necessarily preferable, but like your Amazons of the world are what I'm talking about here. Why would there be more bureaucratic bloat? There'd actually be less. There'd be way less in a co-op than a shareholder-owned corporation.
Well, I think there'd be more, because in order to make decisions, you have to aggregate all this data and then determine what to do with it, how to make changes based on that data. Whereas in a free market, you don't have to do that. You just say
it's still a free market. You're competing with other co-ops.
Yeah, but with all these within the co-op, you're setting standards, right? Like the people have to be paid a minimum of this much, and they have to get this much ownership, and there had to be this much ownership say, and But
that in itself is just set by the co-op's organizing documents, just like a corporation sets its own wages based on the decisions made by a management team that are elected by shareholders. A co-op sets wages based on
how about this? The simple fact that it's an intentional structure versus an emergent one it means that there's more work.
A corporation is not an emergent structure. That's a creation of the state. Literally.
Let's boil it all down to someone is creating a job, someone is taking a job, right?
Right.
So I'm just saying, if you impose a structure on that based on whatever philosophy, premise, what idea of fairness, anything, just by doing that, in my opinion, you're creating more work somewhere, versus if you just let it all happen naturally and said, here's a job I have, do you want it, yes or no? Great, let's get on with it. Or no, see you later. I just think if you're imposing something on it, otherwise, what's the point? Obviously you have to work to maintain that imposition of whatever structure you're talking about.
I don't really get what you're saying, because there's with I can't really honestly comprehend
So basically you're creating rules that have to be followed, right? And in a free market structure, you're not creating rules that need to be followed. You're saying this job is available at this price, that job is available at that price. Do you want it? Yes or no? You take it.
Yeah, but this is no different. No one's making you work for a specific co-op. You take a job that you want. That co-op has rules about how you vest in and become an owner, et cetera. And I don't think co-ops are a cure-all, but I think it's for certain. I'd prefer smaller businesses that are individually owned. But the co-op thing is basically a recognition that certain businesses aren't going to be individually owned like that. They're going to require just a larger size. And for those businesses, co-op is what I would. And by the way, Mondragon's not the only company that does this. Publix Supermarkets, that's a U.S. company, It's one of the largest supermarket chains in the entire United States. That's owned by its employees.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not like a wild thing that doesn't exist.
Sure. I know it
and
exists.
I typically what happens in these setups is management team is paid much less. That's the norm, but that's because in a for-profit corporation, management essentially has no how do I put this? Management has the incentives are mismatched, right? If you know, in a for-profit corporation, shareholders they don't really care about the long-term health of the business. Management doesn't care about the long-term health of the business. They all care about the next quarter. Where in an organization that has input by the people that are actually working there, they actually care whether this thing survives 5 or 10 years, right? I mean, that's the main difference.
Yeah, maybe at a
Talking about large
certain
businesses.
size,
Now, smaller businesses right now, absolutely. If you own a store or a bar or a restaurant or whatever, you're very vested in making sure that organization continues, into the future, let's say. Very much so. But that sort of incentivization of longer term thinking tends to disappear once your company gets over a certain size. It certainly tends to disappear once your company's publicly traded. It's gone. Like, you're not going to have any incentive for that kind of thinking at all. And we've seen that, over and over again. So,
right. Well, I'll leave that point to stand because I lost track of time and we're getting on here now. But I do have some rapid fires that I usually finish with if you have the time. But if you wanted to finish your point about Germany and determination, because that's where
that
we
was
paused.
It. I just see co-determination as a middle step before. My main point in 3 sentences was small and medium businesses, individually owned. Large businesses is like a 3-step process towards getting to a good solution. Unions first, co-determination second, hopefully eventually co-ops. Co-ops aren't perfect. You'd still need market regulation, probably. We don't have time to go into why this is in the event of a cooperatively owned company. But that's it. That's just a few examples of things that I think are a good idea. And also in the short term, obviously, vigorous enforcement of antitrust.
Right. Got it. All right. So this last section, Jeff, is there's 2 portions. There's one that's just a list of questions, and you can answer as brief or as long as you wish.
Yeah.
And then the last part is word associations, where I just fire out a word. You tell me the first thing that comes to your head.
Okay.
First one is, what is money?
Money to me is I could talk an hour about this.
It's the toughest one, I promise.
Yeah, it is the toughest one.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to use the fancy terms like medium of exchange and store. Well, I guess I have to. I was going to say money to me is primarily a store of value, a way to save your wealth that's waiting to be deployed. And then as part of that, it also has to be accepted as a medium of exchange so that it can in fact be deployed. One of the problems we have today is we don't have a good money. So in order for store of wealth, people have to invest in all kinds of crazy things that create bubbles, as I'm sure that you know.
If you had to explain Bitcoin to a 10-year-old, what would you say?
I would show them the episode, the DuckTales episode. You know what I'm talking about or no?
No.
I can't believe more Bitcoiners don't know about this. I guess because they're so young. There's an episode of DuckTales.
I love DuckTales.
Yeah, there's an episode of DuckTales where Huey, Dewey, and Louie get a hold of this it's like a ray, like a gun, and when they point it at things and they shoot, the gold multiplies, right? So they can go into like Scrooge's vault. I haven't watched this thing in forever, but you can find it on YouTube. And they shoot the gun, and like the money, they can make more gold. So they think this is awesome, and they start like going all around town buying stuff. But what happens is there's so much gold all around town that like hot dogs start to be like cost like huge amounts of gold. It's basically like an explanation of how fiat currency works. There's an episode of DuckTales. It's like perfect.
Awesome. I'll have to check it out. How will you know if Bitcoin has failed? What will be the hallmark or sign?
So that's a great question because I think there's numerous things. I'm going to kind of answer this question backwards. There's two different ways I think Bitcoin can be successful, right? The number one way is the one that everyone talks about, hyper-Bitcoinization, okay? There is a second thing that I would still consider to be a success. If Bitcoin exists, stays in circulation as a stable store of value, and the dollar is forced to harden itself so as to prevent hyper-Bitcoinization. So there'd be a system where you'd be using dollars. They wouldn't be perfectly hard. You'd be using them for your day-to-day purchases. And you'd be maybe using Bitcoin for your longer-term savings, for international transactions, for certain transactions where the dollar is censored. I still consider that a success. Now, many people say that that's an impossibility, and I understand why, because the best money always wins out, right? But in this case, I still could see a system like that, dollars for transactions. It's kind of like the silver and gold situation, right? Bitcoin for the, international purchases, long-term savings, things like that. There's a variety of reasons that could happen. For instance, and I'm not pessimistic on Lightning. I'm not at all, but let's say it didn't work out, right? That's one reason that something like that could happen. Or, a scenario where as Bitcoin's taking off, the dollar really does harden and get pegged to something. Well, we may never get enough adoption at that point to get hyper-Bitcoinization, right? So there's a couple different ways that could happen. I would consider that scenario also to be a success. The failure is if neither of those two things happen. In other words, Bitcoin just kind of falls out of circulation.
You have one resource, a book, article, podcast episode, website to refer to someone who's just coming into the space. Which is it?
You mean to learn about Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Bitcoin Standards, Safety's book.
What other investments are you interested in? Or just one?
So, here's the thing. This is how I'll answer that question. I think that most investments in our current economic system are a scam. So I don't even know how to.
I was picking that up from the end of our last conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So nothing else.
I think you got to do the best that you can. I don't want to give people specific financial advice, so I'll just leave it at that.
All right. What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone just entering the space, the Bitcoin space?
Understand why you're involved in it, and that really goes to reading Safety's book. Don't look at it as like a penny stock trading type thing. A lot of people get involved in Bitcoin because they look at it like a penny stock, right? Like they look at it that way, and those are usually the people that get into altcoins as well.
Mm-hmm. What movie or song is most related to Bitcoin in your opinion?
The Big Short, the movie. Because it was a book, but it was also a movie.
Yeah. Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is Bitcoin's biggest vulnerability? If not, why not?
Yeah, it can be stopped. Can it?
How?
It can be stopped. Could it be stopped from? I'm not saying it's likely. Could it be stopped from ever becoming a global phenomenon? Sure. At the end of the day, if we had a really totalitarian government that was like really monitoring your internet traffic and things like that, and was able to, because ultimately they control the internet backbone, right? If they could find a way to prevent nodes from communicating, and I know there are people that have workarounds for this kind of stuff like Gotenna, et cetera, but that kind of thing would prevent mass adoption, I guess, at least. Now, I don't think that that's likely because there's already enough people that have power behind making those sorts of decisions that own Bitcoin, that it's in their interest not to do so. You follow what I'm saying? And that's sort of the advantage of, for instance, Wall Street getting involved in Bitcoin with the futures. I don't care about that as a way to onboard people. I hate bankers, you know what I mean? But I think it's good because now there's people that have real power in society that are financially incentivized not to try and kill it.
Right. What is something about Bitcoin you don't understand very well or you'd like to spend more time learning about?
I do not completely, I understand conceptually how ECDSA math works, but I don't, I couldn't sit down and manually do the math by hand. I think that would be
You and me
kind
both.
yeah, yeah. And have you read Jimmy Song's book?
No, not yet.
Yeah, he goes like more like deeply into
Right.
that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. When, if ever, do you think the first central bank will start adding Bitcoin to the reserves, and will they exist in 20 years, do you think?
Central banks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think central banks will still exist in 20 years. I think this whole thing's going to be much, much slower. Not to be a pessimist, but I think the whole thing is going to be a lot slower than people think it is. Not slower as in like 1,000 years, but like some people think in 10 years, just fiat currency is going to be gone. And I don't think that. I don't think in 20 years it's going to be gone either.
Right.
I could be wrong. Who knows? I'm just prognosticating. So as for when central banks start buying it, they probably one of them somewhere probably already is.
Right.
So I'd say it's probably already happened.
What have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin?
Huh. I think I've become, I was always a big saver, but I've like become an even bigger saver. And always have been skeptical of finance, but have become even more skeptical of finance.
I think that's pretty common, both of those things. Do you have what's your most controversial or contrarian view or opinion? If nothing on Bitcoin, any subject is okay.
Well, I'm not a capitalist, right? As long as we've just discussed for the past.
Yeah, we got that one.
Yeah, I mean, by some definitions of capitalism, I would be, right?
Right.
I suppose, but certainly not by the Austrian The only reason I say that is because the distributists in their writing, despite sincerely believing in private property and not calling for the elimination of markets altogether, Chesterton and Bloch did explicitly state in their writings that they were not capitalists. So I just kind of piggyback off of their use of the term. Whereas, like, to a Marxist, I would be a capitalist. So
right.
it's all a matter of degree, I suppose.
Yeah. Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years, not financial advice, just speculating.
5 years. Oh man, I'm like horrible at the price stuff. I'll give you an answer, but let me say first, I'm horrible at the price stuff because I don't really pay attention to it. Like I don't pay attention to the day-to-day price, and I don't know anything about financial modeling, like at all. I don't know anything about technical analysis. Like I'm a CPA, but that's not what we do, right? So I don't know anything about that at all. So I'm just gonna like randomly say $100,000 because it's a round number.
Fair enough. What if we are wrong? Will anything change? What, if this whole Bitcoin thing, we're all wrong about it, how would it affect you?
It won't affect me at all. I mean, my worldview would still be entire. See, that's kind of interesting because I think most Bitcoiners, that would be tougher on, because if you have a really strong libertarian or anarchist worldview and this fails, I think that I don't want to speak for anybody with those worldviews, but you might need to look a little, maybe, depending on the reason why it failed, you might need to take more of a look at that worldview. But I don't share that worldview, so I don't think it would affect my view of the world or human nature or political economy much at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it's an important tool. I think it's a really promising tool. And I'd be super bummed if it didn't work out, but
What about your past has positioned you to care about Bitcoin? And this is a question submitted by Will Reeves, the CEO of Fold.
Okay. What in my past has
positioned you to care about
Bitcoin? I guess here's the thing. Why? All right. I've been very successful, right? I've been very lucky, but I grew up in a place where, as compared to a lot of Bitcoiners, not all, there's Bitcoiners from all spectrums and walks of life and things of that nature. But I grew up in an area where a lot of people were not all that successful, right? And they weren't reliant on family money or anything like that. They were more reliant just on their labor and being able to save, right? And I kind of seen firsthand how rough many of the economic changes over the past 30 to 40 years have been. And I think that one way which we can better people is by giving them an easier ability to save and better themselves. And also, I guess even more specifically, move away from a debt-based economy, right? Because that's how these people really get screwed. If you're like a workaday laborer and the system is sort of intentionally designed such that your wage is so low that and you don't have a good savings mechanism, that you have to sort of borrow, right? Oftentimes just to get by at various times in your life. And then once you've borrowed, you're sort of in this subservient relationship to your lender and you're kind of stuck. And I think Bitcoin makes a debt-based economy a lot more difficult, and it also makes saving for these people a lot easier. And if they can save, that's really the ticket out of sort of what we refer to as like wage slavery.
Mm-hmm. What is one question you'd like to see added to this list? You can pass if you like, but if there's anything you think would be a good thing to ask to some of the guests that come on.
Give me 1 minute on this one.
Yeah, sure. I'll ask you another question while you're mulling that one. The last one of this section is one book everyone should read. Not a Bitcoin book. Is that the implied?
Sure. Well, because you already asked me the one thing to read for Bitcoin, and I said
not a Bitcoin book.
I said Safe's book. Yeah. So that's good. For people listening to this podcast, I think you should read, specifically because you're not going to agree with it if you're listening to this podcast. I think you should read Marx's Capital, Das Kapital. I think you should read that to see the diametric opposite of your own beliefs. And if you reject the whole thing outright, that's what I would expect from most of the people listening to this podcast. But I think exposure to that stuff is good. And by the way, I say that as, my family fled the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution in Russia. So I'm not a communist or anything, but I think there's a lot of tools you could pick up from something like that. To go back to a question that should be added to the list. I don't have anything for you, man. That's lame, but I just on the spot like this, I don't have anything.
I know. I get it. No worries. All right, last part. This is the rapid fire part. So I'll say a word. You tell me the first thing that comes to your head. Democracy.
Good.
The Lightning Network.
Uncertain. Not pessimistic, but